The fluorescent lights hum overhead at Cedar Creek Medical in Denver, casting harsh shadows across sterile white corridors that smell of antiseptic and something underneath, the metallic edge of fear that lingers in every hospital, no matter how clean the floors. Danielle Ross moves through the cardiac unit with careful invisibility, her movements efficient but unremarkable, the kind of presence that makes people forget you were there the moment you leave the room. She's been here 18 months, longer than she stayed anywhere since Tikrit, longer than she promised herself she would ever stay in one place again. The badge clipped to her scrubs reads Danielle Ross, RN in faded blue letters. There is no rank beneath it. There is no rank anywhere except in the faded patch sewn inside her jacket lining, a 4th Infantry Division unit patch the color of old blood, the only proof Captain Danielle Ross had ever existed at all. She reaches for a supply cabinet in the medication alcove, and her sleeve rides up. A thin scar runs across her inner forearm, pale white against the tan line of old combat deployments, the kind of scar that only comes from shrapnel that missed the artery by millimeters. She pulls the sleeve down without looking at it. Muscle memory. The scar is just information now, and she stopped listening to information a long time ago. Before each shift, she touches the unit patch through the fabric of her jacket. Not quite prayer. Not quite ritual. Just the smallest acknowledgement that she was once someone else, somewhere else, in a place where the screens had names attached to them. The morning briefing happens at 6:06 a.m. in the cramped break room that smells like burnt coffee and the particular desperation of the night shift trying to hand off their disasters to someone else. Danielle stands at the edge of the group, listening to bed assignments and incoming admits with the same focused attention she brings to everything, the kind of attention that notices things. The kind of attention that misses nothing. Trauma admit, bed 7, says Patricia, the night charge nurse, running her finger down the admit log. Sergeant Marcus Webb, 48 years old, cardiac history, admitted through the ER at 4:30. Some minor arrhythmia they want monitored. Nothing critical. Stable vitals. He's asking for the head nurse. Danielle doesn't move. She doesn't react. But her breathing changes, just barely, just enough that only someone trained in reading body language under fire would notice. And there is no one in this break room trained in that. Marcus Webb. Sergeant Marcus Webb. She knows that name. She knows it the way you know the name of someone who held your son's life in his hands on the other side of the world. Webb commanded the 1st Platoon of Charlie Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Her son, David, was a lance corporal in that unit. Webb sent her one letter in 3 years, a single page saying her son was alive, was serving with honor, was in good hands. That letter came through unofficial channels, smuggled through someone's mother who had connections, delivered to her in this very hospital break room by a chaplain who didn't ask questions. That letter saved her life. Danielle. Patricia is looking at her now, head tilted. You good with 7? Yes. Her voice is soft, measured, the kind of voice that apologizes for existing. I'll take him. Danielle moves through the morning charting with the same meticulous precision she brings to everything, each entry documented, each vital sign recorded with the exact timestamp, each medication cross-referenced against the hospital's billing codes and the insurance company's approved protocols. Her handwriting is small and dense, the product of years of writing reports in the dark, in sand, in places where clarity was the difference between soldiers going home and soldiers coming home in boxes. She's been at Cedar Creek Medical long enough to notice things. Long enough to see that Dr. Mercer's billing codes don't quite match the procedures that actually happened. Long enough to notice that phantom consultations appear in charts for patients who never had consults. Long enough to notice that when she documents things accurately, the discrepancies become visible. And when discrepancies become visible, people who benefit from those discrepancies start to notice you. She charted 17 patients last week. 16 of those charts now sit in Dr. Mercer's office, reviewed and returned with minor notation changes. The 17th, the patient she documented a medication error on, caught before it reached the patient, has vanished into a locked file. But that's not her problem. That's never her problem. Her problem is to move through the world without creating ripples. Her problem is to keep her head down and her son safe and her past buried so deep that no one, anywhere, will ever dig it up and ask questions. She reaches bed 7 at 7:15 a.m., rolling a blood pressure cuff on a cart that squeaks slightly with each turn, the kind of small sound that announces her presence before she rounds the curtain. Sergeant Marcus Webb is sitting up in the hospital bed, and he looks smaller than she expected. Older. The kind of tired that comes from carrying other people's weight. His eyes are alert though. Military eyes. Eyes that have seen things and made peace with the seeing. Good morning, Sergeant Webb. She moves to the bedside with practiced efficiency, setting the cuff on his arm with careful gentleness. I'm Danielle Ross. I'll be your primary nurse this morning. How are you feeling? Better than yesterday. His voice sounds like gravel in a tank engine, rough and warm but still running. The doc says I went into some kind of irregular heartbeat. Nothing serious, but they want to watch it overnight. She nods, not really listening anymore. Her hands have already taken over the work, checking the foresight, verifying the saline drip, noting the monitor readings. Her hands move through the assessment like they're following a map she memorized years ago. This is what she's good at. This is what she was trained to be, back when being a captain meant something, back when lives depended on her steady hands and her ability to make decisions in 3 seconds that other people would take 3 hours to think about. We'll keep you comfortable, she says, and she means it, and that's the only honest thing she's said all morning. Sergeant Webb's eyes focus on her. Really focus. The kind of look that means he's seeing past the scrubs and the name badge and the careful invisibility. You ever serve? He asks quietly. It's the first real danger of the morning. It's a question that deserves a yes or a no, and both answers destroy something. She reaches for the blood pressure cuff and doesn't look at him. My son did, she says. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Charlie Company. The silence that follows lasts exactly 2 seconds. Then Sergeant Webb moves his arm slightly, and when she looks down, she sees his hand, weathered, scarred, the knuckles marked with the same small white lines that mark her own knuckles. The marks of combat first aid under fire. The marks of holding pressure on arterial bleeding with your bare hands while rounds came in. The marks of survival. Dark Horse, he asks, using the unit call sign. She doesn't answer. She doesn't trust herself to answer. She just finishes the blood pressure reading, 118/76, normal, stable, good, and documents it in the chart with careful precision. What she doesn't notice is that Dr. Mercer has appeared at the nurse's station, watching her work through the window of bed 7. What she doesn't notice is the way he's making a note in his own personal notebook, the one he keeps locked in his office, the one that tracks which nurses ask too many questions and which nurses notice too many discrepancies. What she doesn't notice is that she's just become a problem that needs solving. She finishes the initial assessment at 7:16 a.m. and moves on to bed 5, then bed 3, then bed 9, her charting growing more detailed with each entry, each notation more meticulous than the last. This is her defense and her offense both. The truth, documented so carefully that lies become impossible. The evidence, recorded in such perfect detail that anyone reading it would have to acknowledge what's really happening in this hospital. Except no one reads the whole charts. No one reads carefully enough. No one thinks that a quiet nurse with steady hands and obsessive documentation could be anything more than a nurse. But Danielle knows what she is. She touches the unit patch one more time, hidden beneath her jacket where no one can see it, where no one can ever see it, and she moves to the next bed, and the next, and the next, a ghost moving through the corridors of Cedar Creek Medical, charting truths that no one will ever connect to her, helping people who will never know her name. At 8:15 a.m., the shift supervisor assigns her a second patient, and then a third. By 9:16 a.m., she's managing 7 beds on her own. By 10:11 a.m., she's charted 43 different observations and caught 2 medication errors before they reached patients, one a potential fatal interaction, the other a dosage that would have caused bleeding complications. She documents both with clinical precision and reports both according to protocol. Dr. Mercer watches her from the nurse's station, making more notes, and somewhere in the mathematics of his mind, he's calculating how much her careful charting costs him. He's calculating that precision, that attention to detail, that refusal to let small things slide, all of it is a threat. He's right. She is a threat. She just doesn't know it yet. What happens next will change that. Morning round started like most mornings at Cedar Creek Medical, the fluorescent lights humming their monotonous song, residents clustered around Dr. Mercer like disciples waiting for gospel. Danielle had already been on the floor for 3 hours, checking vitals, documenting everything with a precision that had kept her alive in Tikrit. Her handwriting was a habit from a life that didn't exist anymore, careful, dated, time-stamped to the minute. In the military, documentation was the difference between a court-martial and a medal. In nursing, it was just called being thorough. She was in Sergeant Webb's room when Mercer arrived, his white coat pristine, his timing perfect for maximum audience. Webb's daughter-in-law sat in the visitor's chair, and 3 medical students flanked Mercer like Secret Service protection. Danielle was adjusting the foredrip, her movements economical, unnecessary. She had learned long ago that efficiency was invisible until someone needed to blame you for something. Mercer stopped. His eyes locked on her chart. The room's temperature didn't drop, rooms don't do that, but something shifted in the air pressure, the way it changes before a helicopter lands. He looked at the vital signs, the medication log, then at her. His smile was a wolf showing its teeth. "Nurse Ross," he said, loud enough for the medical students to memorize every word, "perhaps you can explain to everyone why you administered 10 milligrams instead of the prescribed 5. Danielle looked at the chart. The order was there in his own handwriting. 10 milligrams. She had verified it twice, documented it, initialed it. She kept her voice level, professional, the voice she'd cultivated over 18 months of being nobody. "Doctor, the order clearly states." "Are you calling me a liar, Florence?" He didn't wait for an answer. The nickname was a blade, delivered in front of his audience like a magic trick. "Look how controlled I am. Look how she crumbles. In front of a patient's family, you're going to argue with me." Webb's daughter-in-law shifted uncomfortably. The medical students didn't move. They were learning something today, but not about medicine. Danielle took one measured breath. The kind of breath she'd learned in desert compounds where panic killed faster than IEDs. She felt the tear form before she could stop it, not from fear or shame, but from the sheer exhaustion of restraint. She let it fall. Didn't wipe it immediately. Let him see it. Let him think he'd won. Then she wiped it away with the back of her hand, never breaking eye contact with Mercer. Her jaw was steady. Her hands didn't shake. When she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave without her permission, the voice of someone who had ordered men into situations they might not return from. "The truth has a way of surfacing, Doctor, even when buried under paperwork." The medical students blinked. Webb's daughter-in-law made a small sound, not approval, but recognition. Mercer's jaw tightened, a muscle flickering near his temple. He didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked out of the room, his entourage trailing behind him like a funeral procession in reverse. Danielle finished checking before, her hands moving on their own. Muscle memory. She had held a soldier's hand while a medevac landed. She had done needle decompression at 2 in the morning in a Tikrit alley. She had done a lot of things that she was supposed to forget. An uncomfortable public humiliation was nothing. It was practice. But that wasn't the worst part. 20 minutes later, Danielle was restocking the medication cart when she heard the marker squeaking. She didn't need to look to know what Mercer was doing. The unit board was in the hallway outside the nurse's station, and his handwriting was large and deliberate. She could hear the other staff members stopping their work, gathering to look, the way people slow down at accident scenes. When she finished her task and walked past, there it was in blue ink, visible to every staff member on the floor, every doctor who made rounds, every hospital administration person who walked through. Danielle Ross, dosage error, formal right UP. No context. No explanation. Just her name and the accusation, hanging on the board like a scarlet letter printed in dry erase marker. She stood there for 3 seconds, reading her own condemnation. She didn't tear it down. She didn't cry. She walked back to the nurse's station and pulled up the next patient's chart, her fingers steady on the keyboard. The trembling wasn't fear. It was something else entirely, the kind of pressure that builds behind a dam, waiting. Mercer was already working the phones. She watched him from across the unit, his office door closed but his voice audible through the glass. She saw him with his cell phone pressed to his ear, saw him write something on a legal pad. Favors being called. Pieces being moved. He was good at this part, the institutional chess game where power moved through personal relationships and whispered calls to hospital board members. She recognized the skill because she'd seen it before, in different uniforms, in different countries. It was the same everywhere. Power wasn't what you could do. Power was who owed you something. By that afternoon, she heard the rumors starting. Jennifer mentioned something about prior complaints. Tom said he'd heard there were questions about her employment verification. Sarah, the one who had stood and left the break room like everyone else, didn't make eye contact anymore. The machinery of institutional destruction was running smoothly, and Danielle was watching it happen from inside the mechanism. The break room was where it crystallized. She had made a sandwich at home, turkey on wheat, the same thing she ate most days because it was efficient and required no decision-making. She sat down at the small table by the window that looked out onto the parking lot, and 3 nurses, Jennifer, Tom, and Sarah, immediately stood. They didn't finish their meals. They didn't look at her. They just stood, their chairs scraping loudly against the linoleum with a sound like nails dragging a crossbone, and they left. The room was suddenly very quiet except for the refrigerator's mechanical hum. Danielle sat alone with her sandwich, staring at the content she no longer wanted to eat. This was the part she'd known would come eventually. Not the dramatic part, the quiet part. The social erasure. The way an entire institutional body could decide, without speaking, that you were contaminated. Mercer hadn't needed to say anything more. He'd written 1 sentence on a board, and the entire hospital had understood. She was the problem. She was the reason things were complicated. She was the nurse who made things difficult. She pushed the sandwich away and rested her forehead on the small table, just for a moment. Her jacket was on the chair beside her, and she could feel the weight of what was sewn into the lining, a faded 4th Infantry Unit patch, the only physical proof she had kept that Captain Danielle Ross had ever existed. She'd considered cutting it out 100 times. It was a security risk. It was a talisman. It was both things at once. At 7 p.m., Mercer found her at the nurse's station. He didn't approach directly. He waited until she was looking at something else, and then he leaned against the counter with the casual confidence of someone who had already won. "I've noticed your charting style raises questions about previous patient records," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. It would be unfortunate if those questions reached administration. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. They both knew what he was saying. Your attention to detail is going to be your problem. The very thing that kept you alive is going to be the thing that destroys you here. Her hand moved instinctively to her jacket, to the weight of the patch. She caught herself mid-motion and gripped the edge of the counter instead. Her knuckles went white. Mercer watched with something like satisfaction before he walked away. 3 days would pass before everything changed. 3 days of double shifts and lowered eyes and the systematic unraveling of her reputation. 3 days of Mercer making calls and Danielle understanding, with crystalline clarity, that she had made a critical error. She had drawn attention. She had been seen. And in a life where being invisible was the only safety net you had, being seen was the same as falling. 3 days. That's how long Danielle had been walking the corridors of Cedar Creek Medical with her name erased from every conversation, every chart review, every moment that mattered. The whispers didn't bother her anymore. The empty chairs at lunch stopped stinging somewhere around hour 36 of the 72 she'd just completed working double shifts, covering for nurses who suddenly couldn't work her schedule, filling gaps that opened up when the social ostracism turned logistical. She kept her head down, her hand steady, her charting immaculate, every notation crisp, every timeline documented to the second, every observation recorded in the clinical language that had once been her armor and had now become the evidence Dr. Mercer would use to prove she was obsessive, unstable, unfit for patient care. The irony wasn't lost on her. Precision was competence until someone wanted it to be a liability. On the third morning, at 5:17 a.m., Danielle stepped into Sergeant Marcus Webb's room for her routine vital check. The pre-dawn silence hung heavy in Cedar Creek's ICU wing, that particular quiet that belongs to hospitals between the chaos of evening and the machinery of day's shift. Webb was sleeping, his chest rising in the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator that had been weaning him gradually for 48 hours. Stable. That's what the night shift had documented. That's what the monitors had shown. But Danielle had learned to read bodies the way other people read faces. She approached the bedside without hurrying, muscle memory from a decade of combat medicine moving her through the assessment without conscious thought. Her eyes tracked the ventilator display first, oxygen saturation 94%, respiratory rate 16, end tidal CO2 at 38. Normal. The kind of normal that lived on a screen. She placed her hand on Webb's chest, felt the rise and fall of his breathing, and her mind shifted into a frequency most civilian nurses never accessed. Pain was information. Breathing patterns were data. And data was telling her something wasn't right. The left side of his chest was moving. The right side was moving less. It was subtle. The kind of subtle that lived in the difference between 94% oxygen saturation and 92%. The kind of subtle that a tired night shift resident wouldn't catch, the kind that wouldn't register on monitors that showed green lights and steady numbers. But Danielle's hands that had held pressure on sucking chest wounds in the rubble of a house in Tikrit, hands that had performed needle decompressions in the back of a Humvee while rounds punched through metal a foot from her head, those hands felt the asymmetry. She pulled the stethoscope from her neck and listened. Breath sounds on the left, clear and full. Breath sounds on the right, diminished. Not absent, not yet, but quieter than they should be. She ran her fingers along his intercostal spaces, feeling for the subtle shift in resistance that told her air was moving where it shouldn't. A tension pneumothorax didn't always announce itself. That was the secret they didn't teach in nursing school, the truth that lived in the gap between textbook presentations and the human body's refusal to follow a script. Sometimes a patient could look stable for hours while a collapsed lung slowly shifted the organs in the chest cavity, compressing the heart like a hand closing around a fist, building pressure incrementally until the moment came when the body couldn't compensate anymore. She made a note in Webb's chart. Asymmetrical breath sounds, right side diminished. Recommend physician follow-up and repeat imaging. Clinical language. Careful language. The kind of observation that documented her competence and gave her deniability if things went wrong. They would go wrong. She knew that the way she knew her own name, the way she knew the scar tissue patterns on her own hands, the way she knew what 6:36 a.m. would sound like when it arrived. She finished her rounds. 10 other patients, all stable, all predictable, all the routine pathology of post-operative recovery and chronic disease management. Her mind tracked them on autopilot while another part of her, the part that had lived in Tikrit, that had made split-second decisions under fire with nothing but instinct and training between her and death, stayed locked on Webb's room. At 6:15 a.m., she returned. She didn't have a clinical reason to return. She had no new orders, no change in his status that required assessment. She returned because the pressure in her chest told her to, the same pressure that had saved 17 lives in a compound that wasn't on any map and wasn't called by any name the Pentagon would acknowledge. Webb was awake now, watching the ceiling. He didn't acknowledge her, which was fine. Most patients didn't. Most patients didn't know that the quiet nurse with the careful hands was the only thing standing between them and the chaos of their own body's betrayal. She checked the monitors again. Oxygen saturation now 92%. A 2-point drop in 15 minutes on a patient who was supposed to be stable. The vital signs were still reading green. The alarms weren't sounding. The system saw nothing wrong because the system was built to see obvious crises, not the slow accumulation of pressure that happened in the spaces between official measurements. She looked at Webb. Really looked at him. His jaw was tighter than it had been at 5:17 a.m. His breathing was shallower. There was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before, the kind of muscular bracing that happened when the body knew something was wrong even if the conscious mind hadn't caught up yet. "How are you feeling?" she asked. 10 words maximum. The habit had become natural now, the compression of communication into its most efficient form. "Tight," Webb said. His voice was thin. "Chest feels tight." She didn't respond with reassurance. She didn't say it was probably just anxiety or the lingering effects of surgery. She reached for the ventilator adjustment panel and increased the oxygen concentration to 100%. "I'm going to get the doctor." But at 6:32 a.m., when she paged the on-call resident, Dr. Palmer didn't respond for 4 minutes. At 6:36 a.m., when he finally appeared, he looked at the monitors, saw the green lights, and told her Webb was probably just anxious about being extubated. "Vitals are stable," Palmer said. He had the look of a resident who'd been up for 18 hours, the kind of surgical resident who came from a program where sleep deprivation was currency and caution was treated like weakness. Danielle said nothing. She changed nothing. She documented everything. At 6:44 a.m., Webb's oxygen saturation was 88%. The number was starting to slope downward now, a gentle angle that would become a cliff in minutes. His breathing was faster. His lips were pale. He was looking at Danielle with eyes that were beginning to show the first traces of panic, the animal understanding that something inside his body was shutting down. At 6:02 a.m., everything changed. His oxygen saturation crashed from 94 to 78 in the space of a breath. Not 94, that had been minutes ago, that had been before the final collapse of whatever lung tissue was still holding air. At 6:22, the ventilator screen flashed 78 and the monitor began to sound its alarm, a bright digital shriek that meant the body had run out of compensatory room. Webb's chest heaved. His mouth opened. The color drained from his face in the specific way that meant his heart was beginning to fail under the pressure of compressed air crushing its chambers. "I need help in here," Danielle called, her voice low and even, the kind of calm that came from having already died once and walked away. "Now." Dr. Palmer fumbled through the doorway, his eyes wide, his hands already reaching for the phone to page the attending. What happened?" His fingers shook. His training told him to call for help. His experience, such as it was, told him absolutely nothing. Webb's saturation dropped to 72. Then 69. His lips were turning the color of a bruise. The on-call resident was still talking about protocols, about waiting for the attending, about proper procedure. Danielle could see the choice as clearly as if it had been written on the wall. Let protocol work and let Webb die in the 4 minutes it would take for an attending physician to reach the ICU, or break the rules and save him and give Mercer the final weapon he needed to end her career. Her hands were moving before her mind finished the calculation. She reached for the crash cart, found the 14-gauge needle in the pocket where it always was, felt the weight of it familiar in her palm. Her fingers identified the space between Webb's ribs, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the same anatomical landmark she'd used in a Humvee in Tikrit while explosions rocked the vehicle and her own hands had been the only thing between a dying Marine and the void. She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait for the resident to finish stammering. She inserted the needle. There was a hiss. Not loud, but distinct, the sound of air escaping from where it had no business being, the sound of pressure releasing, the sound of a life uncorking itself back into the living world. Danielle watched the monitor as the saturation climbed. 71%. 78%. 85%. The numbers moved like a hand opening, releasing the grip around Webb's heart. His color began to return. The panic in his eyes shifted into something else, recognition, maybe, or gratitude, or the simple animal relief of being able to breathe again. The respiratory therapist, Linda, was staring at her with an expression that had cycled through shock and into something that looked almost like awe. "Where did you learn to?" "Step back." Danielle's voice had changed. It was no longer the careful, deferential tone of the nurse she'd been pretending to be. It was the voice of someone who had made battlefield decisions, who had moved under fire, who had lived in the spaces where protocol meant nothing and results meant everything. "We need a chest X-ray. Now." Linda was already moving, already reaching for the phone, her muscle memory responding to the authority that had suddenly filled the room like air pressure changing before a storm. That was when Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway. He took in the scene in a single glance, the needle still in Webb's chest, the hiss of air still faintly audible, Danielle's hand steady on the plunger, the monitors showing saturation climbing back into the safe zone. His eyes moved from Webb to Danielle to the resident who was now officially obsolete. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. Which was worse? "What the hell is happening here?" Palmer, nervous and desperate to distribute blame like cards from a marked deck, immediately said it. She performed a procedure beyond her scope. "I was going to call the attending, but—" "You were going to let him die," Danielle said. Still that new voice. Still that command that didn't ask permission. Tension pneumothorax. The signs were there from 5:17 a.m. Asymmetrical breath sounds. He needed decompression. "You're a nurse," Mercer said. "Not a doctor." "Yes." "You performed an emergency surgical procedure." "Yes." "You're suspended, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building." He turned away, already moving toward the hallway, already reaching for his phone. "Document everything, Dr. Palmer. We'll need it for the termination hearing." The guards appeared like they'd been waiting in the wings. Danielle didn't resist. She didn't argue. She didn't explain that she'd saved his life, that protocol would have killed him, that she'd made a choice between her career and his survival and made it without hesitation. She simply walked toward the elevator while Mercer's voice echoed through the ICU behind her, calling board members, calling allies, calling in favors to build a case, his words carrying the particular venom of a man who'd just watched his control slip away and was determined to rebuild it through any means necessary. "Yes, I need you to pull her employment verification," Mercer said into his phone, his voice sharp with the hunger of a predator who'd tasted blood. "And her references. Everything. I want to know if there's anything in her background, anything at all, that we can use." The elevator doors closed on the sound of his voice. Danielle stood in the empty car as it descended, her hands finally beginning to shake, her composure finally beginning to crack now that no one could see it breaking. She had saved a man's life. And in doing so, she had shown Dr. Mercer exactly who she was. The on-call resident froze. His hands hung at his sides like weights. Sergeant Webb's oxygen saturation had plummeted to 68% in the span of 4 heartbeats, the monitor screaming its electronic alarm, each beep a countdown. The young doctor's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Danielle moved. Her hands didn't hesitate. Muscle memory doesn't ask permission. Her fingers located the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the exact anatomical landmark burned into her muscle tissue by 8 years of surgical training in conditions that textbooks don't cover. She prepped the site with antiseptic that smelled like iodine and desperation. The 14-gauge needle sat ready in her palm, steady as a surgical laser. "Step back," she said to the frozen resident. Not a request. A command. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping from Webb's collapsed lung filled the room, a sound like pressure releasing from a broken valve. Immediate. Violent. Necessary. The respiratory therapist stared. His eyes widened. He'd seen nurses work before. He'd never seen a nurse work like this. Webb's oxygen saturation climbed. 72. 78. 84. Climbing steadily as his lung reinflated, as his body stopped suffocating from the air that had filled his pleural space instead of his alveoli. Danielle's hands moved to secure the needle, tape applied with surgical precision. Every movement economical. Every movement correct. 91%. Stable. The respiratory therapist's mouth opened slightly. How did you? The elevator doors burst open. Dr. Mercer stood in the doorway. His jaw clenched. His eyes went from Webb, whose color was already returning to normal, to Danielle, whose hands were still positioned at the needle site. He understood immediately what had happened. A nurse had performed an advanced procedure. A nurse had stepped outside her scope of practice. A nurse had saved a patient's life and, in doing so, had handed him the termination he needed. Out of the way, Mercer said quietly. The kind of quiet that comes before explosions. The resident scrambled aside. Mercer approached Webb's bedside with the expression of a man who'd just found exactly what he was looking for. He checked the needle placement, checked the vitals, checked everything with methodical precision. Then he turned to face Danielle. My office. Now. The walk to the security office took 90 seconds. Each second felt like a year. The hallway smelled like floor cleaner and fluorescent hum. Mercer walked ahead of her, his posture rigid, his hands clenched at his sides. When they arrived, 2 security guards were already waiting. He'd called ahead. Empty your pockets, Mercer said. Danielle complied. Keys. Phone. The small amount of change she carried. All placed on the table with the same deliberate care she used to place surgical instruments on a sterile field. Your badge, he continued. She unclipped the badge from her lanyard and set it down. Cedar Creek Medical printed in blue letters. Danielle Ross, RN, printed below it. 8 years of identity, compressed into a plastic rectangle. One of the security guards stood. We need to inventory her locker. They rode the elevator to the 4th floor in silence. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects. Her locker was at the end of the row, cream-colored metal, combination lock, nothing special. The guard spun the combination, and the door swung open. Inside, extra scrubs. Compression socks. A small mirror. Hand lotion. And hanging on the hook, her jacket. It was navy blue, hospital-issued, worn at the cuffs. She'd worn it every shift for 18 months. The security guard reached for it and began patting down the pockets. His fingers paused when he hit something in the lining. There's something in here, he said. He pulled the inner seam open carefully. The stitching gave way. Inside, folded into a small square, was a faded patch. Olive drab fabric. A unit insignia. The 4th Infantry Division emblem, worn from years of being carried close to the heart, never shown, never revealed. The guard held it up. The patch caught the fluorescent light. For a moment, everyone in the corridor stopped breathing. What's this? The guard asked. Danielle's voice came out level. Quiet. The voice of someone who'd learned to compartmentalize survival. Just an old patch. Nothing important. Mercer stepped forward and took it from the guard's hands. He turned it over, examining it like it was evidence at a crime scene. His eyes narrowed. He placed it in a clear evidence bag with deliberate care, then sealed it. It stays here, he said. Confiscated property. Back in his office 40 minutes later, Mercer sat behind his desk with the termination letter already drafted. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with the velocity of his own power. 2 hospital board members stood beside him, their signatures already on the page. Gross negligence. Unauthorized procedures. Violation of scope of practice. Each phrase crafted to ensure she would never work as a nurse again. But Mercer needed one more thing. Validation. Confirmation that his story would hold. He picked up the phone and dialed the Colorado Board of Nursing. His voice became solicitous, concerned. Yes, I'm calling to report a serious credentialing concern. One of our RNs performed an emergency decompression procedure today without authorization. Yes, a needle decompression. No, I'm not certain she has the training. No, I'm not certain she should be working anywhere. The response on the other end made him pause. Then slower, I see. Those records are restricted? For what reason? Yes, I understand. Thank you. He hung up. His jaw clenched. The Colorado Board of Nursing didn't restrict records. Not for nurses. Not for anyone. He made a second call, this time to a clinic in Nevada where Danielle had listed as a previous employer. Yes, I'm trying to verify employment history for a former staff member. Danielle Ross? Yes, RN. You have no records of her employment? Can you tell me why? I see. Those files were sealed by federal order? I don't understand. Who would seal employment records? The third call went to a hospital in Arizona. Same response. Records unavailable. Restricted. Federal involvement. Mercer sat back in his chair, fingers drumming against the desk. His strategy had been solid. His power had been sufficient. But something had just shifted. Something was wrong with this woman's background. Something official. Something protected. No matter. She was still fired. She was still done. He visited Sergeant Webb's room that afternoon with the termination letter folded in his pocket. Webb's son was there, a young Marine with the bearing of command. Mercer's expression became sympathetic, concerned. I wanted to speak with you personally, Mercer said, settling into the chair beside the bed. About what happened this morning. The emergency decompression. Webb asked, his voice still hoarse from the tube they'd had to place earlier. That nurse saved my life. A very dramatic way of putting it, Mercer said smoothly. But what actually happened is that the nurse in question failed to recognize the early signs of pneumothorax, signs that a more experienced clinician would have caught hours earlier. She created an emergency situation through negligence, then performed a procedure far beyond her training to compensate. Webb's eyes narrowed slightly. That's not what I saw. You were in respiratory distress, Mercer continued. Your judgment was compromised. The nurse has been suspended pending termination. I wanted you to know that we've taken appropriate corrective action. Webb said nothing. But his son leaned forward. What's her name? Danielle Ross. She'll no longer be working at Cedar Creek Medical. The young Marine's face went very still. It was the kind of stillness that comes from processing information that doesn't fit the narrative he'd been given. But Mercer was already standing, already leaving, already confident that the story had taken hold. At 3:17 a.m., Danielle sat in the same booth at the same all-night diner. The one on Federal Boulevard where the coffee never cost more than $3 and nobody asked questions about the people who came at impossible hours. The coffee in front of her had gone cold. The surface had developed a thin film, the temperature dropping with each passing minute. She'd been there for almost an hour. Her reflection in the window was a ghost. A woman without a name. A woman without a badge. A woman without the patch that had been the only physical proof of who she actually was. The rain had started around 2 a.m. It hammered the parking lot with the kind of intensity that made the asphalt smell like wet minerals and exhaust. She watched each droplet hit the glass and slide downward, following physics instead of choice. That was the difference between water and humans. Water had no say in its trajectory. Her phone had buzzed at 2:43 a.m. An HR email. Termination hearing scheduled for tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. All personnel files would be reviewed. Final paycheck would be processed. Please collect personal property from your locker between the hours of 8 and 9 a.m. on your way out. She'd read it 3 times. The words didn't change. The consequence didn't diminish. 8 years. She'd built 8 years of anonymous safety. 8 years of being a good nurse, a reliable nurse, a nurse who asked for nothing and caused no trouble. She'd done it for her son, so he could grow up without knowing his mother was marked. So he could sleep without fear that someone would come looking for her. So he could have a normal life because she'd sacrificed an extraordinary one. And in 3 seconds, she'd blown it apart. She reached for the coffee cup and took a sip anyway, though the taste was bitter with cold. The diner was nearly empty at this hour. An old man at the counter reading a newspaper from yesterday. A trucker in the corner booth, head tilted against the window. A waitress with dyed black hair and tired eyes refilling coffee cups with the mechanical precision of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. Danielle thought about tomorrow. She would accept the termination quietly. She would listen to Mercer's rehearsed speech about protecting patient safety and maintaining professional standards. She would nod at the appropriate moments. She would walk out of Cedar Creek Medical with nothing, no badge, no patch, no proof. And then she would disappear again. It was what she'd trained for. It was what she'd done before. Extraction. Reinvention. The ability to become someone else so completely that the previous version ceased to exist. She'd done it after Tikrit. She could do it again. But her son was 15 now. He had friends at his school. A basketball team. A girlfriend. A life in Denver that was rooted and real and couldn't be relocated without destroying it. How could she disappear if she had to stay? The waitress approached with a fresh pot. "Warm that up for you, hun." Danielle looked at the coffee. At the cold film across the surface. At the reflection of her own face in the cup, distorted, dark, barely recognizable. "No," she said quietly. "I'm done with this one." She paid the bill in cash, $5 for the cup, $2 for the waitress. No tip that would be remembered. No interaction that would be noted. She stood and walked toward the door, her movements economical, her expression neutral. Outside, the rain continued. It soaked through her jacket, the jacket they'd taken, the jacket without its patch. Water ran in rivulets down her face, and she didn't wipe it away. For a moment, standing in the parking lot at 4:15 a.m., she let herself feel the weight of it. The exhaustion of being invisible. The price of survival. Then she raised her head, squared her shoulders, and walked toward her car. Tomorrow she would attend her termination hearing. Tomorrow she would accept whatever came. But tonight, in the dark, she allowed herself one terrible realization: saving Sergeant Marcus Webb might have destroyed the only life her son had ever known. She didn't know what was about to change everything. The morning she returned to Cedar Creek Medical to collect her belongings, the ER was unusually quiet. Danielle had arrived early, before shift change, before the chaos began. She was standing at the supply closet near Bay 4 when the ambulance radio crackled. Incoming, 48-year-old male, chest pain radiating to left arm, cardiac symptoms probable, ETA for minutes. The paramedics wheeled him in at 7:23 a.m., and Danielle didn't look up from the clipboard she was pretending to review. Then she heard the voice. In Arabic. A single word that stopped her breathing. Al-Malak. The patient's eyes were locked on hers. Iraqi eyes. Eyes she recognized from a dusty fire base in Tikrit 8 years and 3 months ago. Khalid. The translator. The man who had written her call sign on the side of a Humvee in black marker. The man who had watched her extract 2 wounded soldiers from an ambush with nothing but a tourniquet and absolute precision. You are Al-Malak, Khalid whispered again, his English heavily accented but unmistakable. His chest heaved with exertion. I know you. I know your face. The angel. The one they sent when it was hopeless. Danielle's hands were steady. That was the most important thing. Her hands did not shake. She moved toward the monitor, toward the EKG leads, toward anything that would give her a reason to turn away from those eyes. But Khalid kept speaking, kept reaching for her, kept saying her name in a language that was supposed to stay buried. A Marine Corps liaison was standing in the hallway. Captain Stevens. Uniform crisp as new cardboard, insignia polished to a mirror shine. He had overheard Khalid's words. His posture changed. His eyes narrowed. He was looking at Danielle the way soldiers look at ghosts. Get me his security file, Stevens said into his phone. Not a request. A command. Full clearance. I don't care if it takes 3 hours. I need to know who brought in this patient. He was already moving toward the ER office, already pulling encrypted files, already making calls to people whose names Danielle didn't want to know. Within 52 minutes, he returned to Bay 4 holding a classified document that made his jaw tighten. He read aloud slowly, each word a weight dropping into the silence. Citation for extraordinary heroism under fire. Captain Danielle Ross, 4th Infantry Division, for courage and skill in extracting 2 critically wounded personnel from active ambush zone, Tikrit, Iraq, March 15. Subject demonstrated advanced medical knowledge, tactical precision, and disregard for personal safety. Recommended for formal recognition. Stevens looked up from the paper. His voice was different now. Respectful. Captain. The door burst open. Dr. Mercer. His face was the color of spoiled meat. His hands were shaking, actually shaking, which meant he already knew. Someone had told him. Someone had whispered the truth into his ear and watched his empire crack. Security! Mercer was screaming. Remove this delusional former employee from my hospital immediately. She's making wild claims, confusing patients, creating a hostile work environment. His voice was rising, becoming unglued. She performed an unauthorized procedure 3 days ago, endangered a patient, and now she's here spreading lies about military service to gain sympathy. This is psychiatric. This is pathological. Stephen stepped between Mercer and Danielle. His presence was like a wall of armor shifting into place. Stand down, Doctor. But Mercer kept going, kept spiraling, kept trying to rewrite reality through sheer volume. I don't know what story she told you, but I have documentation of her incompetence, her recklessness, her complete disregard for hospital protocol. The doors opened again. A 2-star general walked into Cedar Creek Medical like the building had been waiting for her all along. Major General Patricia Holloway. Her uniform was dress blues, immaculate, decorated with ribbons that represented a quarter-century of service. Her presence made the fluorescent light seem dimmer by comparison. She didn't speak. She simply walked to Danielle, stood at attention, and saluted. A formal military salute. Her right hand to her forehead, her eyes forward, her entire body a statement of respect. Then she turned to address the room. For the past 2 weeks, the general said, her voice like a tank idling in a garage, the Federal Bureau of Investigation has been investigating financial irregularities at Cedar Creek Medical. Specifically, insurance fraud involving Dr. Lawrence Mercer. Phantom consultations. Inflated billing codes. Systematic theft totaling approximately $2.4 million over 36 months. Mercer's face went gray. An FBI agent stepped forward from behind the general. Young. Professional. Carrying a folder that was thick enough to break something. Dr. Mercer, when you attempted to access Nurse Ross's employment records to build a termination case, you triggered federal alerts. Her identity is protected under Classified Directive 2847B. Your inquiry was flagged by the Pentagon within 17 seconds of submission. The agent opened the folder. That inquiry led us to examine your other activities. Your billing practices. Your consultant arrangements. Your relationships with hospital board members. What we found was systematic healthcare fraud. Mercer tried to back away. His shoe caught on something. He stumbled. Jennifer was standing in the crowd. Tom. Sarah. The 3 nurses who had walked out of the break room, scraping chairs loudly against linoleum, leaving Danielle to sit alone. Their faces were ashen. Their mouths were open. They were watching the man who had instructed them to shun her get dismantled by federal law enforcement in real time. Dr. Lawrence Mercer, the agent continued, producing handcuffs that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. You're under arrest for healthcare fraud, wire fraud, and attempted falsification of federal records pertaining to a protected Department of Defense asset. The cuffs clicked. Once. Twice. Mercer's wrists turned purple almost immediately. This is absurd. This is a witch hunt. Mercer was thrashing now, his composure completely obliterated. She performed an unauthorized procedure. She endangered a patient. She's the criminal here. Sergeant Webb appeared in the doorway of Bay 3, pole in hand, chest bandaged where the needle decompression had saved his life. He stood there in hospital-issued pajamas and sheer determination. "She saved my life," Webb said. His voice carried the weight of command. "And she served with honor. Extraordinary honor. Alongside my unit. Under my command. I watched her pull 2 soldiers out of the dust with nothing but her hands and her training. She's the finest soldier I've ever served with." The FBI agents escorted Mercer past the unit board where his handwriting still marked Danielle's name in disciplinary disgrace. Past the break room. Past the supply closet where he had discovered the faded unit patch he had confiscated from her locker, the same patch that was now being examined as evidence. His face was crimson. The veins on his forehead looked like they might rupture. He tried to claim diplomatic immunity. He tried to cite medical exemptions. He tried everything. Nothing worked. The general turned to Danielle. "The Pentagon has declassified portions of your record. Portions that your son deserves to know about." Sergeant Webb insisted on it personally. Webb nodded from his doorway. The full line taped to his arm made a soft hissing sound. "Your son should know who his mother really is." The general handed Danielle an envelope. Manila. Heavy. Official. It had been opened and resealed by at least 3 federal agencies, but the contents were unmistakable. A card embossed with the presidential seal. An invitation. An address. A date. A recognition ceremony for classified service members whose heroism had never been publicly acknowledged. A handwritten note was attached. Sergeant Webb's handwriting. Precise. Military. Personal. Your son should know who his mother really is. He deserves to pin those medals on you himself. We all do. Danielle's hands trembled as she held the envelope. Not from fear. Not from weakness. The trembling was restraint finally released. 8 years of restraint. 8 years of silence. 8 years of being just a nurse in a hospital in Denver, hiding the weight of medals she was forbidden to wear, hiding the rank she could never claim, hiding the truth from the boy who deserved to know exactly who had raised him. She looked up from the invitation. The ER erupted. Residents clapping. Nurses who had ignored her now applauding. Security guards who had watched her collect belongings in silence now standing with their hands over their hearts. The sound filled the space like rain, like recognition, like the world finally realigning to match reality. Jennifer approached hesitantly. "Danielle, we didn't know, we thought." "You didn't ask," Danielle said. One measured breath. When she spoke again, her voice was different. Lower. Commanding. The voice of someone who had given orders in languages most of them had never heard, in circumstances they couldn't imagine. "You accepted what you were told without verification. That's on you." 3 weeks later, local news reported that Dr. Lawrence Mercer had accepted a plea deal. 10 years probation. Permanent medical license revocation. Restitution of $2.4 million. Community service teaching CPR at a community college in Boulder for minimum wage. His name appeared in small print on page 6 of the Denver Post, sandwiched between an article about parking violations and a community calendar notice. 6 weeks later, Danielle stood in the East Room of the White House in dress uniform, the faded unit patch now properly positioned on her shoulder where it belonged. Her son's hands were shaking as he pinned the bronze star on her chest. Then the silver star. Then the purple heart from a wound that had healed but never forgotten. The last medal was a Navy Cross. His hands were crying when he attached it. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. She touched the medals on her uniform. Each one was a decision she had made, a moment where her training had been enough, an instance where she had chosen other people's survival over her own. Because some truths are too heavy to carry until you're ready. The president shook her hand and said something about quiet heroes. The room applauded. The photographers took their shots. The official record was being rewritten in real time. Captain Danielle Ross was no longer invisible. That evening, Danielle sat with her son on the White House lawn. The city lights of Washington, D.C. glowed in the distance like embers. He was still wearing his dress uniform. She was still wearing hers. For the first time in 8 years, she didn't have to hide who she was. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most, she said quietly. I couldn't tell you about my service because I was under orders to disappear. But now you know. Now the world knows. And maybe that means something. He took her hand. It was scarred, calloused, marked by 8 years of trauma and 3 tours of duty that lived in her muscle memory. He held it like it was the most precious thing he had ever touched. Like he was finally holding his real mother. Like this video if you support our troops. And if you or someone you love has served, let us know in the comments, we'd be honored to hear from you. Subscribe and let's get back to the story.